the final vision. When most people think of the Book of Enoch, their minds immediately go to the Watchers. They picture fallen angels descending to Mount Hermon, the birth of the mysterious giants known as the Nephilim, and the devastating global flood. Because the story of these fallen angels is so captivating, it often completely overshadows the rest of the ancient manuscript. But the Book of Enoch does not end with the judgment of the Watchers. It ends with a detailed, highly structured, and intense vision of the final days of humanity. This final section is sometimes called the Epistle of Enoch, and it contains a fascinating prophecy known as the Apocalypse of Weeks. Unlike the Christian Book of Revelation, which uses seals, trumpets, and bowls to describe the end of time, Enoch divides the entire history of the world into 10 distinct weeks. But these are not literal weeks of 7 days. They are vast periods of time, eras of human existence, stretching from the very beginning of creation all the way to the final judgment and beyond. So what exactly does Enoch's final vision actually say about the end of the world? And how does this ancient Jewish timeline compare to later expectations? To understand the terrifying events of the final 3 weeks, we first have to understand how the ancient author viewed the progression of history. The text claims to be a vision given to Enoch, the 7th patriarch from Adam. According to the narrative, Enoch is writing a letter of instruction and warning to his son Methuselah, and to all the righteous generations that will follow. He tells his family that he has learned these things from a heavenly vision and from reading the tablets of heaven. The concept of the heavenly tablets is crucial here. In the ancient mindset, history was not a random sequence of accidents or political maneuvers. Everything was already written down in the heavenly realm. By claiming to have read these tablets, the author was sending a powerful message of comfort to a persecuted audience. He was telling them that the chaos they were experiencing was not a sign that God had lost control. Enoch begins his historical countdown. The first week represents his own time, an era of justice that concludes with his mysterious ascension to heaven. The second week introduces great wickedness and ends with the first major judgment, the Great Flood. The third week centers on a single man chosen as the plant of righteous judgment, which scholars universally recognize as Abraham. The fourth week focuses on the giving of the law and the creation of an enclosure for the righteous, representing the time of Moses and the journey to the Promised Land. As the timeline progresses, the text becomes a compressed summary of ancient Israelite history. The fifth week brings the building of a glorious temple in Jerusalem. But in the sixth week, the text says that all those who live in it will be blinded, and their hearts will forsake wisdom. This era ends with the temple being burned by fire and the chosen race being scattered, perfectly describing the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the first temple in the year 586 before Christ. It is in the seventh week that the tension begins to rise. The author describes the seventh week as an apostate generation, a time when many deeds will be done, but all of them will be wicked. For the original readers of this manuscript, who likely lived in the 2nd century before Christ, this seventh week was their present day. They looked around and saw corruption, political oppression, and religious compromise. They believed they were living at the very end of normal human history. This is the turning point of the entire vision. The first 7 weeks are a review of the past and a critique of the present. But the final 3 weeks are completely prophetic. They describe a sudden, escalating sequence of cosmic judgments that will wipe out evil from the earth and establish a new reality. Most modern readers assume that apocalyptic texts always predict the immediate destruction of the physical universe. But Enoch's vision of the 8th, 9th, and 10th weeks reveals something much more complex. The text does not simply jump to a fiery conclusion. Instead, it outlines a gradual process where the righteous themselves are given a very specific and surprising role in the final judgment of the wicked. Continuo para, approxima parte dois? The transition from the 7th to the 8th week marks a radical shift in the Book of Enoch. Until this point in the timeline, the righteous have been portrayed as victims. They are the oppressed, the blind, and the scattered. But in the 8th week, which the text calls the week of righteousness, a dramatic reversal takes place. The ancient author writes that a sword will be given to the righteous, allowing them to execute righteous judgment on the oppressors. This is one of the most debated and controversial details in the entire manuscript. When modern readers study biblical prophecies, they are accustomed to the imagery found in the Book of Revelation or the Book of Daniel. In those later texts, the final defeat of evil is usually accomplished directly by divine intervention. Angels pour out bowls of wrath, fire falls from the sky, and a heavenly rider strikes down the nations. The faithful are generally expected to endure persecution, maintain their faith, and wait for God to act. But the Apocalypse of Weeks presents a very different scenario. Here, the chosen people are not just passive witnesses to the end of the world. They are active participants, armed with a sword to remove wickedness from the earth. This startling imagery has led to intense debate among historians and theologians. How are we supposed to interpret this sword? One interpretation, favored by many historical scholars, connects this vision directly to the time it was written. During the 2nd century before Christ, the Jewish people were facing severe persecution under the Seleucid Empire. This oppression eventually triggered the Maccabean Revolt, a brutal and successful armed rebellion. Some scholars argue that the 8th week is a literal reflection of this historical moment. In this view, the author of Enoch was telling his community that their physical uprising was not just a political rebellion, but a divinely ordained movement to bring about the final era of justice. However, there is another interpretation. Other experts argue that the sword in the 8th week should not be understood as a literal weapon of war. Throughout ancient Jewish literature, the sword is often used as a symbol for the Word of God or for spiritual authority. Proponents of this view point out that the text emphasizes righteous judgment rather than military conquest. They suggest that the 8th week represents a time when the faithful will finally be given the spiritual authority to establish truth, exposing the lies of the wicked generation that preceded them. Regardless of whether the sword was meant to be literal or symbolic, the 8th week is only the beginning of the end. The text declares that at the end of this period, the righteous will acquire houses because of their righteousness, and a new temple will be built for the great King in glory forevermore. But the timeline does not stop there. The vision continues into a 9th week. In the 9th week, the scope of the vision expands beyond the borders of Israel and encompasses the entire globe. The text states that the righteous judgment will be revealed to the whole world, and all the works of the godless will vanish from the earth. It is during this 9th week that the ancient author makes a chilling proclamation. The world itself is written down for destruction. This is a crucial detail for understanding ancient apocalyptic thought. The writer did not believe that the current world could simply be reformed or improved. The corruption introduced by the fallen watchers and perpetuated by human wickedness was so deeply rooted that the physical environment itself had to be condemned. This brings the timeline to its absolute climax, the 10th and final week. In the 7th part of the 10th week, the text describes the great eternal judgment. But surprisingly, the primary target of this ultimate judgment is not human beings. The text explicitly says that the judgment will be executed against the watchers. The heavenly beings who rebelled before the flood, the entities responsible for the initial corruption of humanity, are finally brought to total justice. According to the vision, they will be cast into the eternal fire, removing their dark influence from creation forever. And it is only after the watchers are judged that the final transformation occurs. The first heaven will depart and pass away, and a new heaven will appear. All the powers of the heavens will shine with sevenfold light forever. The 10 weeks are complete. But the sheer scale of this prophecy left early readers grappling with a difficult reality. If this detailed roadmap of the end was so ancient and so precise, why was it eventually excluded from the Bibles of almost all Christian traditions? Continuo para approxima part tres. The survival of this extraordinary vision presents a fascinating historical puzzle. If the Book of Enoch was so highly regarded by early communities, why did its detailed roadmap of the end times vanish from the Bibles of almost all Christian traditions? For centuries, scholars in the West could only study the text through translations preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which uniquely kept the Book of Enoch in its biblical canon. But in the mid-20th century, a stunning discovery changed the landscape of biblical archaeology. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls found in the Qumran caves, researchers uncovered ancient Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch, including portions of the epistle that contains the Apocalypse of Weeks. These fragments proved that the text was actively read, studied, and revered by Jewish groups long before the 1st century. Early Christians were also deeply familiar with Enoch's prophecies. The New Testament epistle of Jude even quotes the Book of Enoch directly, treating it as a genuine ancient warning against the wicked. Yet, as the centuries passed, the wider Christian church and the rabbinic Jewish tradition began to distance themselves from the manuscript. Part of the reason for this rejection lies in the specific nature of Enoch's final vision. The Apocalypse of Weeks presented a theological framework that eventually became difficult for later religious authorities to accept. When we compare Enoch's timeline to the canonical Book of Revelation, the differences are striking. Revelation focuses on the return of a divine Messiah, a heavenly warrior who defeats the nations while the faithful endure persecution and wait for deliverance. But in the 8th week of Enoch's vision, the righteous are handed a sword to execute judgment themselves. As the Christian church grew and developed a theology centered on grace, peace, and waiting for the divine return, the militant imagery of the righteous taking up a sword to cleanse the earth no longer aligned with their core teachings. Furthermore, after the tragic destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, rabbinic leaders deliberately moved away from the explosive apocalyptic literature that had fueled unsuccessful rebellions against Rome. Modern historians approach the uncanny accuracy of the Apocalypse of Weeks from a different analytical angle. Scholars widely agree that the ancient author employed a literary technique known as ex eventu prophecy, which means prophecy written after the event. By examining the text, experts conclude that the author actually lived during the turbulent seventh week, likely in the 2nd century before Christ. This explains why the first 7 weeks align so perfectly with known ancient history, from the flood to the Babylonian exile. The author was summarizing the past to build credibility for the future. The 8th, 9th, and 10th weeks were his genuine, desperate hopes for how God would finally intervene to end the suffering of his people. So what does Enoch's final vision actually say about the end of the world? It reveals an ancient worldview where human history is not spiraling out of control, but is progressing through preordained eras recorded on heavenly tablets. It tells us that the original readers did not view the apocalypse merely as a spiritual event in a distant heaven, but as a physical, necessary cleansing of the earth. For the author of Enoch, the corruption introduced by the fallen watchers was so deeply embedded in the fabric of creation that the world itself had to be dismantled and replaced. The ultimate resolution required the final imprisonment of those ancient rebellious angels, proving that human wickedness was only part of a much larger cosmic war. The Book of Enoch may not sit on the shelves of most modern churches, but its echoes remain impossible to ignore. It shaped the way entire generations imagined angels, demons, and the final judgment. If you want our next investigation to examine the mysterious timeline found in the canonical Book of Revelation, and who the 4 horsemen were actually meant to represent, leave the word revelation in the comments below.